Thank you, Wayne. My name is Dennis Brown. Good morning, everyone. My co-panelists here today are Claudia Groth and Eric Butler. Claudia, Eric, and I are Oregon State University Master Gardener volunteers. The OSU Extension Service program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. Master gardeners are volunteers, educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers. We serve the community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong learning. We are eager to answer your gardening questions this morning, and if you have questions about the Master Garden program itself, we can answer those as well. And while we go through a few preliminary slides, you might be thinking of questions you can put in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll be able to answer those. I just want to point out a few upcoming events that we have, and also our website where you can find us on the internet. We're at www.metromastergardeners.org. You'll see this come up several times in the next few slides, but here's a screenshot of some upcoming events. If you scroll about halfway down on that page, you'll find these. We have some events coming up in February and March. We're going to talk about growing raspberries, gardening with Pacific Northwest native plants, and that's going to be presented by Eric Butler, who's with us today. We're going to talk about, have a talk on unlocking the secrets to soil health in your garden, and what's the environmental impact of your garden. So those sound very interesting. If you want to check those out, you can sign up for those on our website. You can also find us on Twitter at The Real Dirt and on Facebook at Metro Master Gardeners. And we also, if you go to the metromastergardener.org website, you can use the web form that's on the site or leave us a voicemail message or send us an email if you have questions that you don't get answered today, or if you think of something after this session ends today. So there's still ways to reach us through our website. And now each of us are going to say a few words about ourselves. I said, my name is Dennis Brown. I've been a Metro Master Gardener. Well, I've been a Master Gardener for 10 years. I have a background academically in horticulture and plant biology. And right now, a couple things that are making me really happy and excited in the garden is I'm seeing my spring flowering bulbs come up. My crocus have been in bloom for a couple weeks. I just noticed my shooting stars coming up. And in my vegetable garden, I've been harvesting chard and some kale, and I even have a little bit of sprouting broccoli left growing that came out really well after the storm. So Claudia, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
I have been a Master Gardener since 1989 and worked in the program during teaching as well as learning. My academic background is in plant science and in soil management. And I've also spent a good deal of effort learning about insect and disease control. What's making me happy in my garden is just looking out over the snow-covered grasses, which makes it look a little bit like a prairie in my backyard, and just enjoying the reveal of the garden after the snow. Eric.
My name is Eric. I've been a Master Gardener since 2015, and academically, I'm an ecologist and geographer by training. I'm really interested in gardening as a kind of a way of enhancing the urban landscape, of helping maintain biodiversity and natural resources in the urban environment. And one thing that's making me really happy right now is it's been an unusually good winter for backyard birds this season.
Thanks. And so with that, we're now ready. If you have questions, we'll try to answer them.
Thanks, Dennis. I do see a question come in. I have plants that look like the recent cold blast killed them. Is there any chance they may rebound, and how can I tell?
Well, I'll start. Yeah, there's every chance that they'll rebound. There's a couple of things that we think of in this kind of times. Sometimes the snow can be an excellent insulator and can keep those plants more insulated. We're shivering up on top, but they're toasty warm down there. So patience is really your best tool at this time, to wait and see what happens. Maybe one side might have gotten a little more of a blast, and so as the leaves come out, you can shape up that plant. So it's important, I think, to me, not to act rashly. Let's wait and see what happens. Maybe it'll come out a little bit later, and you'll think, oh, it's not going to come, but it will.
I think that's a great recommendation. I see that in the I'm thinking of both ornamentals and vegetables. I see in my vegetable gardens that some things looked a little beat down by the snow and they were kind of droopy when it was cold. But this morning I went out and a lot of things have perked up. Like my cover crops, which I have out there, I have fava beans, looked pretty droopy when it was cold. But this morning they're all perked back up and they look just fine, and they got covered, as you said. The snow covered them, and that sort of acts as an insulator for some of that. So I think that's a good point, that kind of wait to see what happens and before you do any big pruning on things.
And I put a little reference in the chat for folks, publications from the Forestry Service on kind of how to approach it after the storm.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed in there that I looked at one of those publications, and they had some people, like, if I have a tree down or my tree is damaged, they often wonder what to do. But the Pacific Northwest Society of Arboriculturalists actually have information on their website about certified arborists who can look at your trees, and if you have some major damage, what to do about that damage and how to handle it. If it's too much for you to trim off, if the branches are too big for you to trim off yourself, or also just to come out and inspect the tree to make sure there isn't some hidden damage that's weakened the branch. So that's a really great resource to have to look at. That's the PNWISA.org, Pacific Northwest International Society of Arboriculturalists.
And I think a lot of times with perennials, it's one thing, little shrubs, but with trees, I think it's really important to know when not to do it yourself, when to call in the experts, because we don't want to see those trees come down on our gardeners. That's
right.
I know a lot of small branches came out of my trees, nothing big, but a lot cleaned out those dead twigs. So that's a plus in my book.
Well, so we did have an inquiry about a large branch that was ripped off, and I have to say that I myself had that happen. So the question is, what should be done in that case?
Well, I would say if it's a large branch and it tore off partly or came off, I would definitely have an arborist look at it. If it's a small branch, some of these publications that have appeared in the chat give you recommendations for how to address that. You'll want to make you'll probably need to go back and make a cleaner cut depending on how it was broken off of the tree. And there's some good guidance, again, in these documents that have been posted in the chat about how to do that and what to look for. But if it is a fairly large diameter branch, or if you suspect that there's been some damage to a branch, and just to make sure that there isn't a branch that's been weakened, definitely have it checked out by an arborist.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So we have a question. Is it too early to fertilize garlic? Zone 8B, Portland, Oregon.
I think right now is actually a pretty good time to fertilize it. Garlic doesn't need a lot of food, but if a little supplemental feed shouldn't hurt.
So I did catch the name of the plant. What was the plant?
Garlic.
Oh, just garlic. Yeah, yeah. It's okay time. With most vegetable crops, my garlic is up probably about, I haven't looked at my garden for a while, but I planted fall garlic. I planted it in October, I think it was, in my garden. And I noticed that a couple weeks ago, it was about 4 to 6 inches tall. So it's putting on some pretty good growth by this time already. And well, because of the weather, I haven't been to my garden, so I'm not sure how big it is now. But since it is growing, now's an okay time to put on a little bit of fertilizer. Wouldn't be bad, but and also later in the spring when it really starts to grow once the weather warms up.
Are they particularly, I haven't grown garlic in many years. Is garlic a particularly heavy feeder? Is this the kind of thing you want to feed throughout the season?
I don't believe garlic is a particularly heavy feeder. I haven't seen, I'd have to look it up to be sure, but it's not like a crop like corn or something that actually has a fairly high nitrogen demand. I think in the home garden, the garlic, a modest amount of fertilizer is probably fine, or just compost. I haven't put any fertilizer on my garden. It has a fairly high organic matter content because it's growing in a community garden. I should add that. And over the years, people have added a lot of compost into that community garden. And so the organic matter is up in the range of, well, I measured it last year and it was 20%, which is a little higher than it should be. Yeah. Ideally, it should be around 8 to 10%. So I haven't been putting any, and my plants have been doing great. They've been doing fine, but I'm not adding any more compost to my garden for now because that organic matter is sufficiently high to meet the demands of nutrient release and stuff from that. So I've not added any, and my garlic and my other plants have looked great. The only crop that I fertilized last year was I did give my sweet corn a little fertilizer once it got to be between shin and knee high. So I gave the little nitrogen fertilizer to give it a boost because that's when it's really growing rapidly in that period. Once it gets about knee high, it really shoots up quickly. And so it puts on a lot of growth and has a high nitrogen demand. So I did give it some of that at that time.
The community gardens are quite a challenge, as you said. Yours has gotten a lot of compost over the area, but many of these have been depaved parking lots and compacted lawn areas or something else. And I think they really do sometimes present a challenge to people when they're first starting. And I think really taking a look at the plants, how are they doing, to decide, kind of what you need, fertilizer or some more organic matter, because they are a little bit of a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Great, thank you. So here's another question. Do you have suggestions of good cover crops for home gardeners to have in their asparagus bed, given there is no emerging vegetation for such a large part of the year?
I actually don't recommend a cover crop for your asparagus. What I usually do is put a layer of compost on my asparagus in the springtime before it emerges. And that's all I do to it other than keep it weeded. If you put something else there, it will sort of compete with the asparagus. And in fact, asparagus, of course, in the spring, you get the spears, but then in the summer, you let the asparagus spears mature. Starting about the end of June, you should stop cutting back your asparagus spears and let the spears that come up mature so that you'll have asparagus spears the following spring. And of course, then you want to leave those in, and those fill up by late July and August. The entire space that I have my asparagus planted in is filled with these wonderful, spidery asparagus plants, and they stay on until fall, usually October, and I think late October is when they turn yellow, about the same time as blueberries turn red, because they're next to my blueberries. So I have red blueberry leaves next to yellow asparagus plants, and they look really beautiful at that time until I cut them back probably in late November or December and sort of clear out the garden. So I don't really recommend any cover plants around there, maybe, but some nice layer of compost is good. Good source of nitrogen, so maybe a layer of 2 or 3 inches of compost at the beginning of the growing season.
Great, thanks, Dennis.
If you don't need more compost, as Dennis says, even just a cover of something like straw or any kind of cover that's going to keep weeds down and protect the soil surface. So it doesn't need to be a cover crop, but a cover might be something to consider.
Good point.
Great. And just to let you know, you got an appreciation for answering the garlic fertilizer question. So here's another question. I would like to try growing some native plants by seed. Can you recommend some that are easy to grow? I'm new to gardening. It would be for a sunny spot.
I'd say for a sunny spot, you could do just about any sort of meadowscaping mix. There's a lot of stuff that you can grow from seed individually, but I particularly like having a diversity. So I go to someplace like, there's a local company called ProTime Lawn and Garden Seed that sells a lot of native plant seed, and you can order a mix of stuff off their website, or there are other suppliers around. And so you can get stuff that has different native grasses, different wildflowers, different forbs, even a few things that are, sometimes you can even grow a few shrubs from seeds, but yeah, for the most part, there's a lot of different stuff you can go for. So bunch grasses, quite a few different wildflowers. Yarrows are really easy to grow from seed. California poppy, it's easy to grow from seed. So you've got a lot of options.
Eric, some of the, so the California poppies that we're used to, they have the golden color, that's lovely. But I've seen in seed packets poppies that are California poppy looking, but different colors. Would those be considered, do you know, would those be considered as well a native, kind of a native, if we could mix up the colors a little, maybe?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting question when you're getting into what are called nativars. It's they're basically kind of ornamental selections of native species. And California poppy is a complicated one too, because it's a really wide geographical range. You find them everywhere from British Columbia to New Mexico. And so if you just go to your local garden center, buy a seed packet that says California poppy, you don't necessarily know where it's from. So it's worth trying to source that locally. And so if you're getting a nativar, and there's nothing wrong with growing an ornamental plant either that's derived from a native species, that just understand there's a possibility that's going to have less of an ecological function. So if you're interested in growing native plants to attract bees or something like that, then going with a species is likely to give you better results than going for anything that's more kind of bred and developed, especially if you're getting something that has doubled petals or something like that, because that's the interesting thing about doubled or tripled flowers, that it's been bred so that the parts of the flower that would ordinarily be producing pollen and nectar have been mutated to become additional petals. And so that's a flower that's really not producing any sort of floral resources. It's got a structure that pollinators don't know how to deal with. As long as you have kind of single flowered plants, and those are likely to have a lot of the same benefits as kind of the wild species. Well, although having different colors and things like that can sometimes be a little confusing as well.
Confusing for the pollinators.
Yeah, exactly.
I did not realize that when I think about double petal flowers, I think about it being difficult for the little guys to get in there, but I didn't realize that they had actually been bred to have a different structure. That's really interesting. Yeah. I think a lot of times, I mean, I think of things like wild roses and how, you know, truly lovely they are. And they're the ones that just have the single petals and maybe even just bloom once a year. And how you can use those in your garden kind of as their delicateness. It doesn't always have to be the fluffiness, but you can work in some of these really delicate and beautiful, more simple flowers.
Yeah, if you're interested in growing woody native plants, those are generally a lot easier to grow from either cuttings or from bare root plants. So you can get those for really cheap. There are a lot of native plant sales that will sell mostly bare root plants. You can get those for $1 to $3 per plant for something that just looks like a little stick, but it'll take off in a hurry once it gets in the ground. It takes a little bit of technique to know how to plant them right, but I've planted mostly bare root shrubs, and they actually do seem to do better than potted stock.
I have quite a few natives in my yard, and I started most of them from fairly small potted plants that I got at some of our local native nurseries in the area. So I have a lot of like the perennials. I have things like shooting stars and fawn lilies, and just those, even those were, I bought in like little 3-inch pots or 2-inch pots. And I have tried to save seed from them. We were talking a little bit about this before we came online. I think we were talking amongst this, and I have saved seed from them. And, you know, it takes a while to grow some of those perennials from seed to get them large enough. California poppies is a good one if you want, you know, the best bang for your buck, because you'll get, orange flowers right away the first year.
Yeah, the other thing too about most of our native plants are really used to dropping their seeds kind of in summer into fall, and they really need the cold, wet conditions over winter to have good germination. So the best time if you want to grow native plants from seed is to put that out in the fall, let it overwinter, and let it germinate on its own time in the spring. So like if you have some seed around, you get it out into the ground right now, we'll probably still have enough chill and wet left to have some success, but really September, October is kind of the best time to be doing that.
I had, we've been talking about that meadow that I'm working on down in the demonstration garden. And I had planted out a packet of wildflower seeds, as you say, Eric. And the grasses were just starting to come up, and so we had a real big layer of chips on there. And I wondered, well, maybe I'll just throw them out in October and see what happens. You know, as you say, they're supposed to be planted then. Well, we had to dig them out. They were so vigorous because they were crowding out the grasses and everything. So, you're so right. We had just wonderful response. Just throwing it out in October, and then I did nothing until spring. You know, it was just Mother Nature watering and the coolness. So, so from that experience alone, I can back up that fall is the best time for those wildflowers.
So I have actually a couple of questions that might be related specifically to the native plant topic. One is, can you recommend a native plant that makes a good ground cover?
It kind of depends on what your needs are, but like if you're looking for something that's just really tough, that can take some foot traffic, that's not going to require any sort of maintenance, but like if you have a parking strip or something you want to fill in, a Kinnikinnick is pretty close to foolproof. It's evergreen, it's attractive year round, it has nice looking flowers and fruits on it, has good ecological benefits, and once it gets established after the first couple of years, it just grows like crazy and needs absolutely no supplemental water. It does like full sun, prefers good drainage, but it's not too picky about that. Again, Kinnikinnick is one of those really widespread species, though. It basically grows throughout the entire colder part of the northern hemisphere, and so you get Kinnikinnick stock from everywhere from Siberia to Massachusetts. And so again, it's worth sourcing it from a native plant nursery or looking for kind of locally sourced stock. There's a good again, one of these nativars that's known as Vancouver jade that's developed up at Washington State University. I think it grows really well in our environment. But yeah, it's like a lot of plants in the heath family, you put it in the ground, it'll just kind of sit there for 2 or 3 years, not really doing much until it decides it's happy, and then it'll just take off. If you've got something, looking for something that's in more kind of a sheltered spot where people aren't going to be tramping around too much, we have a lot of native stone crops that are very attractive as well. Those are also evergreen.
Eric, I think it's worth emphasizing something you said early on about how once they get established, that it does take, a little bit of care at first.
Yeah, and yeah, even a native plant, even a really drought tolerant native plant, if you plant it, it's going to want some supplemental water for the first 1 to 2 years just to be sure that it survives. And once it's really situated well, then you can kind of back off and let nature take its course. But it's really right plant, right place, right care, even if it's native. And I'll talk about this at quite a bit more length at my native plant talk next week, but really the idea that native automatically equals low maintenance, automatically equals drought tolerant, all that's quite a bit more complicated than that. So it's kind of the right care for getting things established, and every native plant has its niche within our landscape. And so some things are really well adapted to kind of dry, sunny, tough locations. Other things really like to grow in wetlands or like to grow in deep shade, or so it's, again, right plant, right place, right care.
One of the plants that I've used as a native that I've used as a ground cover is it's the forest strawberry, Fragaria, I think it's Vesca. And it's been, it's not a high traffic area, but it's under some other ornamental plants. So it does pretty well. It produces fruit, it produces little strawberries, and they're actually pretty tasty.
Yeah, my own parking strip is a mix of kinnikinick and wild strawberry, then a couple other plants. I think I've got some rock rose and some of the creeping golden raspberry in there, and they just all mixed together. It all looks really good together. It's all basically zero maintenance now that's really well established and matured. And basically all I have to do is kind of prune back the edge along the curb, and other than that, just leave it to its own devices. It's really thick and lush, and there's really no weed issues or anything like that, aside from a little bit of grass to keep picking out. But
Eric, I wonder if you could tell folks again where that native plant talk is going to be that you mentioned.
So if you go to Washington County Master Gardeners, it's going to be listed on their events page. So I think Dan will also bring up the link in just a moment.
Yes.
Great, yeah. And I'll make sure that shows up on the Facebook page as well. Thank you.
Then I'll be doing this for the Fix It Fair in March as well.
Wonderful. And we'll be sending that out through our newsletter and social media as well.
I really appreciate the growing knowledge, Eric, that that you can't just throw these guys out into the wilder of your backyard and expect them to just be perfect the first year. That we are, as we know, growing in an unnatural landscape, our backyards or our parking strips, and that we do have to have a little patience and a little extra care, but that it does pay off in the long run.
So we have so thank you for all of that. We have another native plants question, but this is about recommending a native tree that's smaller, won't grow larger than 25 feet for a backyard that is sunny in the morning and shady in the afternoon.
Let's see, there are a few native trees, smallish native trees I really like. One of my personal favorites is Schuyler's willow, which kind of surprisingly for a willow doesn't need a lot of water. I mean, again, once established, give it a good amount of water for the first couple years. But I've got a little grove of Schuyler's willows in my yard that just showed up all on their own, just volunteered, and they're about 25, 30 feet tall. A pretty compact, just nice appearance year round, and incredible habitat value. Willows are probably the single most important early season nectar source for a lot of native bees, which is kind of surprising because people don't think of willows as having really showy flowers, but they produce just tons of floral resources for a lot of native insects. And then throughout the growing season, even through the winter, they also attract a lot of herbivorous insects that birds really depend on. And so, yeah, just kind of a handsome, really low care tree, surprisingly nice looking. Another one I'm a big fan of is serviceberry. It's usually kind of a large shrub or small tree, depending on what variety you get. It has nice flowers on it. It's got berries that are they're kind of sweet, kind of mealy tasting, but the birds really like them. There's another one I had. Pacific crab apple is another good one. It's kind of a flowering tree. It's not quite as showy as a lot of the ornamental crab apples, but it's generally kind of similar, pretty compact. It's kind of nice looking. It likes a little bit wetter conditions, but I've got one that's growing at kind of the base of a hill where it just has some sort of natural water accumulation just pretty well.
Hey, Eric, I just put, this publication has been in the chat a couple times, but I put it up again. It's Native Plants for the Willamette Valley that's published by Metro, and it gives recommendations for small trees and shrubs and ground covers and all different kinds of plants. But if people want a resource that they can turn to, they can go to that link, and there's a booklet that Metro puts out that gives a number of suggestions that might, it also gives the booklet contains information about wildlife value, sun requirements, water requirements, and other things that are useful for homeowners to know.
Yeah, this is really one of the best resources for anyone who's interested in growing native plants in the landscape around here. So it's got good information on all the things Dennis mentioned. It's kind of habitat requirements, its ecological benefits, and even pictures of what the plant looks like so you can get some sense of what you're going to be getting.
And I think you probably said that, but you can order that free from Metro, is that right?
Yeah, if you want a printout version, you can order it free from Metro, and then there's also the digital version that just got posted in the chat.
Metro does distribute some of these publications to the local garden centers. So you may even be able to pick one up at a local garden center when you're in.
And if we were doing this in person, I would have brought a whole bundle with me to hand out. But
right.
Yeah.
Eric, I was interested in what you were talking about birds, wildlife value, the birds. With all this snow, how did the birds survive?
Surprisingly well. The snow complicates things a little bit, but the birds are used to it. They've lived in this environment for millions of years where you get snow occasionally. And so they all have strategies to adapt. Birds, you often see them in the cold parts of the winter. They've really fluffed out their feathers. They really take advantage of the natural down layer they have underneath their outer feathers that creates all these air pockets. So they're really well insulated. And typically they'll be caching food supplies for themselves, and they have their strategies for foraging and for sheltering when you have high winds and stuff. So they're really used to the conditions. It certainly doesn't hurt to put out a suet feed or something for some supplemental calories. Although interestingly enough, there's been a disease outbreak, and so they're currently recommending that people take their feeders down for a month or two and sterilize them with a bleach solution or something, just to make sure that we don't have too many problems. But yeah, supplemental feeding, as long as you're careful about sanitation and at least sanitizing the surfaces, high contact surfaces once a day, changing out food regularly, not putting out too much at any given time, and just keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. Keep your feeders dry, using tube style feeders rather than platforms, since it solves a lot of problems as well. But as long as you're doing it responsibly and maintaining the feeders really diligently, then supplemental feeding is really beneficial. And so that certainly provides an extra source of calories to help the birds get through the cold part of the winter, and also to produce their reproductive success during breeding season.
One of the things that I do in my garden is the temptation is to clean everything up in the fall. Your rudbeckias are done blooming, your echinaceas is done blooming, you just want to cut them, get those dead heads out there. But those are actually good resources for the birds. I actually have noticed several times the finches going after my rudbeckias, my daisies out in my front yard. They're sitting there, pick them clean. I'll pick a seed head at a time until it's clean. So I think those seem like a good idea, not to be too neat in your garden sometimes.
Exactly. It's an excuse to be a lazy gardener. You're doing it for the birds. one thing I'll really often say about gardening for birds is that you really want to build good habitat first, and then think of things like feeders and nest boxes as a supplement rather than as being the primary attraction. If you have, so in my backyard is almost all native vegetation. You can see that there's a line of mature Douglas firs back there. The understory is all native shrubs. I've got in front yard, I've got kind of a meadowscape situation going. So there's just creating a lot of resources, a lot of good habitat, a lot of good food out there in the environment is really the healthiest thing for the birds. And then having nest boxes and feeders and bird baths and things like that as kind of a supplement is really the best way to go about it.
Are there specific plants you would recommend for an urban garden for birds?
Really most natives are good. Even a lot of ornamental or non-native ornamental plants are pretty good. The reason that native plants are particularly good is because they're co-evolved with their local native invertebrates. And so they just tend to attract a lot greater numbers and diversity of bugs that the birds really need to feed on. Because even birds that primarily feed on seeds really rely on having invertebrates to feed their young during breeding season. But I mean, some native plants are particularly good. I mentioned willows earlier. They're kind of the big insect smorgasbord for birds. And for something a lot smaller, for kind of a perennial, red columbine is really good. The finches love the seeds on those, and the hummingbirds like the flowers. Snowberry is a good one because it has these kind of starchy berries that it keeps on the plant all throughout the winter. So it's kind of a good food source when there's not a lot else available. Hazel's good. Wax myrtle's a really good one because the seeds are really oily, and that's a good source of fat that birds like through the winter. Really just anything that provides a lot of food resources, a lot of habitat structures, a good thing. And plants that attract have a lot of epiphytes on them, a lot of mosses and lichens and such. Also create a lot of niches for the food sources they like. I have a flowering dogwood in my front yard. It's not by any stretch of the imagination native, but it's just carpeted in mosses and lichens. It has birds all over it all winter.
My Arctostaphylos, and there's another manzanita, right? That's the one. I've found already hummingbirds around that because it's flowering now. And I don't generally feed hummingbirds, but they love that. And my rosemary, which flowers all winter, which surprised me, but it flowers all winter, and I see birds on that all the time throughout the winter. And so there are a lot of lovely ornamentals that can be. And I just want to put a plug in for your willow, Eric, about my willow was always so covered with insects that it could have fed flocks and flocks of birds. So they are a good insect resource.
And by attracting insects, it doesn't necessarily mean it's attracting pest insects that are going to affect your vegetable garden or anything like that. Most of the herbivorous bugs that are attractive to native plants tend to be fairly specific to the plants they're attracted to. So don't think that you're going to be, by planting willows, you're going to be getting cabbage aphids or anything like that. That's one other good one is red flowering currant, which again is very attractive to hummingbirds. Historically, at least, with the way climate has changed, it's hard to say that anymore. But historically, at least, it always started blooming right around the time the rufous hummingbirds migrated back into the region. And then again, it attracts a lot of native insects. It gets berries that some that fruit-eating birds like during the summer as well. And there are it's one of those where there are a lot of different native Rs as well. So if you're looking for a particular appearance, a particular growth form, or something like that, something that's a little more specific than just kind of whatever wild type you get, then that's a good option because it's been extensively bred over the years, and so there's a lot of different options for that.
Thanks. We have. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Claudia.
I was going to say, Dennis was just talking about leaving some of your flowers to be a little seedy go into the winter. Yes. but also jumping out and spraying your even, you know, a few aphids here and there right away to try and prevent a larger outbreak. I now leave aphids on my roses because I see the little birds come in and pick them off right off my rose buds. I'm like, okay, you guys take it.
Yeah.
I'm going back inside.
Yeah, a flock of bush tits work as well as any insecticidal soap I've ever seen.
And they're much prettier.
Yeah,
much more
they're so
interesting.
cute.
This is wonderful. So we have a couple of questions that are a little bit less about specific plants. I think I'll ask. One is, the past few years, slugs have been having a feast in my garden. Any recommendations for getting control of the situation?
Well, slugs and snails are my particular favorite. And there are a number of methods. There are a number of baits out there that are now approved for use in vegetable gardens and around pets. So those are very attractive to the slugs and snails and move them toward that. And then those pests are taken care of. But also traps are also quite effective. During the day, the slugs and snails are hiding where it's cool and dark. So putting a board out under shrubbery or under your ground cover, someplace where they might be hiding, they'll hide under there during the day. You go out and turn it over and there they are, scrape them into a plastic bag and out they go. So traps with just a board or a pot or
Piece of cardboard.
Cardboard. You can use a beer trap if you haven't had all the beer you can take. But any kind of place like that they want to hide during the day. But do also remember where they are during the day. They're at those places that are dark, your ground covers. They'll be hiding in the edges of things, under pots and things you may have left out in the garden, which you should be cleaning up a little bit better. So giving them fewer places to hide, and then knowing where they are hiding and putting your traps or your baits there. So you don't need to put a big pile of slug bait next to your tomato because they'll head straight for the tomato and miss the pile completely. So think about where they're going to be during the day, where they're going to come out of as soon as the sun goes down, and then put your baits there or your traps there. Or of course you could put your headlamp on at 10 o'clock at night and go out there and pick them out.
That's
I do that.
Do you?
I do.
I don't treat slugs in my garden because I love them. But yes, you can go out there, not at 5:30. They wait until about 10:30 to come out. And you can go out and see what they're attracted to, finding out where they're hiding, what they're attracted to especially can help you be a better slug hunter in general.
It's also worth noting that not all slugs and snails are created equal. It's usually the little slimy gray ones that do the most damage, but you get a lot of different kinds of slugs and snails, or even some kinds that are predators of other slugs and snails. So they'll actually go out and hunt the little gray ones on their own. Yeah,
the Testacella, one of them, it has a tiny little bit shell on the end of it. So it's halfway semi-slug, halfway between a slug and a snail. Those are primarily underground, and they are excellent slug hunters. And also folks who live in more in the interface between the forested areas, more wild areas. Do remember we have beautiful and very attractive snails that are natives and are not the ones that are in our garden. As Eric says, it's those little gray garden slugs that do the more damage than the banana slugs. Banana slugs are not in your yard, but yeah, do consider if you have in a more wild area or have more woodsy or ecologically protected areas, you may see some really interesting and really pretty native slugs and snails.
Yeah, I love the banana slug. I love the Pacific sideband snail too. It just has a really pretty shell on it. They're both detritivores. They just eat dead leaves. They don't touch living plants at all.
No. Yeah, I think if I'm trapping them, like I've put slugs in terrariums for demonstrations or to show children or something. I'll just chop up lettuce and put it under a board because that's what they're attracted to, not something that's living, but something that's on the way down. So yeah, if you ever catch a look at that Pacific sideband, it has this sideband. It has beautiful yellow around the shell with the beautiful mahogany color. Lovely.
I think I'm gonna make this group t-shirts that say slug hunters with a cool, really cool slug mascot on it. So here's another question. My soil is really hard and clay-like. I was going to add some sand to lighten the soil. Is there anything else you can recommend I add?
Please don't add sand. Don't add sand to your, sea soil, yeah.
No sand.
Yeah, don't do that.
Sand plus clay equals concrete.
Yes, right. And yeah, Pacific or Portland cement and gravel. So clay-like and sand-like, put it together and you've got sidewalks. Organic matter. Organic matter is the way to go.
And I particularly like adding organic matter with cover crops because that does, it's good to add an inch or two of compost in the fall, especially if you don't have enough organic matter in your soil. It's worth getting a soil test done to find out exactly what your situation is first before you start amending anything. But especially deep-rooted cover crops will really help break up that dense surface more, and it'll kind of naturally bring some organic matter and root exudates and such deeper into the soil. And just kind of till that in the spring before you plant out your vegetables.
And there are some good cover crops. Thanks for mentioning that, Eric. That one of them is like there's a radish, like the daikon radish is actually a very good thing. It has deep rooted, it's very strong, and it's good at breaking up the soil and opening up your soil a little bit, and then you can work that in as a organic matter in the spring. So those are a great idea to add cover crops.
And I think one of the things about cover crops that I particularly like is the way they cycle the nutrients. They bring them up from lower in the soil to where your plants can use them. You dig them in and there's the nutrients right there. So I think they're a real advantage.
Yeah. So our advice would be don't use sand, use cover crops or add organic matter, compost. And so we do actually have a specific cover crop question that's come in. I planted red clover back in August. When should I turn this into my plot this spring? Well, so someone planted red clover, and so in the spring you should come back and cut it down and till it in. And so what's the timing on that? It depends on what crop you're growing. And red clover is a legume, and it also fixes nitrogen. Many legumes fix nitrogen. They have a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria. And one of the advantages of them is that they add nitrogen to the soil as they grow, because the nitrogen fixing bacteria form a symbiotic relationship with the roots of the plants and produce nitrogen for the plants, and some of that is left over in the soil. And it's also bound up in the soil as the plants grow. And a lot of that production happens early in the spring, just before the plant starts to flower. So the plant's getting ready, it's growing lushly and stuff. So based on when you're going to plant your crop in the spring, I'd let it in until maybe 2 to 4 weeks before you're ready to plant your crop. So if you're planting, say, corn and beans in early, in mid-May or early May, you'd probably cut it back in mid-April. If you're planting something at the end of April, you might cut it back in or middle of April. You might cut it back a little earlier than that. You want to give it a little bit of time, depending on how much growth there is, to decompose, and when you turn it under. If it's too green, it can be damaging your plants. If the growth is very lush from your cover crop, and then you turn it in and it's not fully decomposed, it might cause some problems with the germination of your seeds in the garden. So you want to give it at least 2 to 4 weeks before you're growing, but try to leave it in as long as you can before your crop, because that's when you're getting the benefits from a leguminous cover crop that fixes nitrogen, as you're getting that added nitrogen that it's producing in the early spring before it flowers and you till it in. So I'd say about 2 to 4 weeks before you're ready to plant.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. I'm growing tomatoes for the first time from seed. Any tips for success?
I'll take that one. I grow tomatoes from seed too. That's great. Oh, so it's Claudia. I have a little setup in my garage that I start transplants on, and I plant my tomato seeds the 1st of April. And I have like a little 6-pack, but you can use some other small containers to grow them in. And I have a little heat pad and keep them warm. I think heat is really the key. Heat and light are the key. So I have a little setup in my garage. It's a little propagation heat mat that you can buy online and control the temperature to add a little bit of bottom heat. And I'll start my seeds on April 1st and be ready to transplant them about the 10th or the 15th of May. And they'll be probably 4 to 6 inches tall. And so I start them out with a soil temperature of about 65 degrees. And then I ramp it up to like 70 degrees, as warm as I can get it in my garage to really get that burst of growth late in the season. So if you're growing them from seed, start them about the 1st of April is probably good. And then sometimes when you grow them, if you don't have a heat and you're trying to grow them indoors where it's near a bright sunny window, at least initially before you can move them outside, they'll get a little bit leggy, and that's okay. So they'll get kind of elongated, and it looks like, oh, this plant is really elongated and not very strong. And that's okay, because you can actually plant, unlike a lot of plants, like ornamental plants where you want to plant them at the same level as the soil in the pot that they're growing in. With tomatoes, you actually can plant them deeply. You can actually plant them so a lot of the stem is buried, because tomatoes will produce adventitious roots in their stems, spontaneously produce roots in their stems, so you can plant them very deeply. So I sometimes have a plant that's maybe got a little elongated, is 8 to 10 inches tall, and there's just some leaves at the top. I plant most of that below the ground surface. And so it looks like this little tiny compact plant that I grew, and it does just fine. And you can either do that by digging a very deep hole, or you can just dig kind of a trench and plant it on its side and just kind of carefully tip the end up, and it'll reorient so it's growing straight up. So yeah, start them inside as warm and as sunny a place as you can. If you can add lights or get a heating pad, that's great. And usually I start them around the 1st of April for planting around the 10th or 15th of May.
I will just chime in for one thing. My degree of success increased amazingly with that heat mat. And I know Dennis controls his temperature. I just put him on the heat mat and let it do what it does. So I don't go to near the trouble Dennis does. But that bottom heat really made a difference in my success. I'll agree with that.
Yeah, and in reality, my heat mat probably just cranks up. It probably can only get to 65 or so at the beginning of April, but then by the end of April, because the garage is warmer, it can get to 75. So in reality, that's probably what happens in my house.
Thank you all. We are at about time. And I can give you a few more minutes if there was anything that you wanted to talk about to close us out. But any longer than that, actually, we have another gardening workshop this afternoon that we have to set up for, that's on invasive weeds in the garden from East Malton and the Soil and Water Conservation District. So it's another extended gardening Saturday.
One thing, if I could, Wig, why don't I share my screen one more time so people, if they're watching, can see where to go if they have more questions. So I've just done that.
And I put some more, put the links again in the chat.
There we go.
Wonderful.
Is that up? So if you have additional questions that we didn't answer today, you can go to Ask a Master Gardener at www.metromastergardeners.org and submit a web form or use the telephone number or the email link that's on that web page.